what is the dictatorship of the they? Help us understand. Help us understand what that means.
Okay,
and why it's important.
Before I say, so this is going. I mean, obviously, I'm German, and this is going to be the brutish English for most people. Then what they're about to hear, and it's not just because of my shortcomings, but also because I will have to try to translate Heidegger. I use sort of standard translations, but many of them are not good enough, and the they is one of these examples that where the English language just you cannot translate, right, the German vernacular into English, which, by the way, maybe this will come back to us when we speak about technology later on, is that how we operate in the world now, where we just think we can easily translate any language or transfer any meaning of any language to any other language is not that easily possible. The they, or das Man, is one of these examples. Now that's, Heidegger uses this, talks about this in Being in Time, in Sein und Zeit. And before I say anything about the they or das Man, I should say maybe that Sein und Zeit looks at Dasein, right, which literally means existence, and that this kind of what Heidegger does here is he always begins with the everyday. He looks at tool use, and he uses a hammer, and then he comes up with these notions of ready to hand and present at hand. And he realizes that this is how you have to begin. You begin with the ontic, so-called, and then you sort of almost leap into the ontological and show that there are non-visible phenomena at work that make the world meaningful. And death is the most important of these phenomena, by the way. Now, in terms of the they, Heidegger he doesn't ask a metaphysical question. So he doesn't ask, what's the human being? Oh, the human being is a rational animal, yada, yada. And he asks, who is the human being? That's the question. So it's a very different question. You see, it's already directing, it has a completely different direction. So it's non-representational. If you say, who are you? You can list something, but it would be very strange to do that. So when he asks, who is Dasein in the everyday, Dasein is zunächst, so at first, or always already, das Man. So we are always already inauthentic. That's not something that's negative in the ordinary sense. It's a positive phenomenon, as he says. It's who we are. It's who we are in our everyday dealings is das Man. And in order to make sense of that, or the they, right? You read, one reads what everybody reads, and one does as everybody does, and we think as everyone else thinks. This for Heidegger is how the public works, which is why it's very very skeptical about the media, etc. But this is not external to us. So when he says the dictatorship of the day, it's not some entity somewhere that tells us what to do, but it's us. It's an existential. It's one of our structures. It's who we are. And now the they or das Man, I probably have to explain the German first, is that in German you can actually say very strange things. You can say, for example, so if I was very sad, I could say Mann ist sehr traurig. So I don't need to say ich bin sehr traurig, which is I am very sad. I could say one is very sad, which of course, in English is a posh way of talking about yourself. But you can abstract from yourself by saying Mann ist sehr traurig. You can point away from yourself, and grammatically speaking, Mann is a passive structure. So it's an active passive. It's actually something that's done to you, but it sounds active. So this is how Germans speak. And if you've ever spent time in Germany, or you start watching German films or something, you can notice that das Man is extremely prevalent. And it's prevalent where it really shouldn't be, because there is no generality. It's actually something that talks about us. But Heidegger takes this, as to formally, so das Man, that's an invention. He calls it das Man, right? Because Man is just, it's not capitalized actually. And that to him formally indicates something that's going on, you could say, beneath. And that is that what's at work always already at first is the they, which then structures everything around it. So the being with others is always already structured by this, that existential, right? And that's why he speaks of a dictatorship, because it's dictating us. Or we are in a certain very strange way of taking ourselves, in speaking on Heidegger, unlike Heidegger, taking ourselves not seriously, not being fully pushed into your almost possibilities of authentic being. And we're always already inauthentic, right? And the strange world we live in now is, of course, that big corporations and almost everything talks about be yourself, find yourself, be more than you expected, etc. You can sign up with PricewaterhouseCoopers and be more than you expected, right? So it uses that language of authenticity. It uses that language of living up to who you could be, which is very strange that this is how it's turned out. But that's the power of das Man, I guess. Right?
Now, why is that strange?
Why is that strange? Because I think that when you think about that's maybe a bit of a historiographical point now, but when you think about when this is written in the 20s. So it's after the death of God. Right? This is, for Heidegger, this is very real. It's a very nihilistic age. And it is about why is the question of being coming up again? And it's the question for the meaning of being. So obviously, Heidegger responds to nihilism. And we will get back to why he talks about response so much in the history of being. It's all about responding and how we respond. And it's very important that, so the way we have responded, you could say, to that very strange historical situation that we're in, where God is dead, right? The way we have responded is that, all of a sudden, we need to take our authentic possibilities of existence very seriously, but that's been sort of, you could almost say, subsumed or consumed or devoured almost by, if you like, capital, right? So it uses that language. It takes it that because it's so highly adaptive. It can just
right.
So it works with that. So and it makes it even emptier. It's by. Of course, but this is how language is so dangerous. It's because, as Heidegger quotes Hölderlin quite often, that language is the most dangerous good given to mortals, given to us. Why? Because language can point to something that really is, or something that is by not being, but that's privative. So it's there, but it's just a seeming, and we're right back in the cave, obviously now, right? I mean, this is the oldest problem of thinking is this problem of what is.
Oh, real quick, can you turn your volume down? Because I think my voice is getting some feedback on your end. So if you just move your mic away from the outcoming audio on your computer, or turn your audio down.
Yes.
So the das Man, the they, it's this kind of default state that human beings tend to find themselves in. It's a state of alienation, a state where their possibilities for autonomous creative thinking or action are basically captured by a kind of generic, bland dictatorship of just mass human inertia or something like this.
Yeah, but it's us, right? It's not something else. It's
right.
There's no central organ somewhere that dictates that to us. It's just, it's in us. It's who we are. It's one of our structures. And I mean, if you want to take a step further, that's inauthentic. It's always already sort of running away from itself.
So, okay, here's my next question then.
Yeah.
What is then authenticity, and how do we get it?
Well, so you don't get it, right? Because it's not a state and it's not a thing.
Okay.
It's itself. I mean, if you want to go a bit beyond Heidegger, it's that Eigentlichkeit. The German is Eigentlichkeit, and the Greek the English comes from the Greek authos, which means yourself, but in German there's a sense of eigen, which means ownership, owning, right? So be yourself, become who you are, or be yourself and own it. I mean, that's one of the first steps. But the way you could say with Heidegger, and so you never reach full authenticity, because that would mean, to speak in some other regard about Heidegger's philosophy, is you cannot have full disclosure of anything. If whenever there is presence, concealing or self-concealment is already at work. That there cannot be nothing very. You see that book, you don't see the other side of that book, which is not a very good example, but it makes it, it shows something to someone who's not maybe too familiar with it yet. What happens with if you reach authenticity, there's no reaching it. There's no state of inauthentic and authentic. There is a tension between the two that are always already simultaneous. And that once you are authentic, say, you will always you can only be authentic insofar as you are inauthentic. There's always that tension. But freedom, as it were, happens precisely in that tension by resting yourself and owning it from inauthenticity all the time. And that happens most radically by pushing forward, running forth towards death. And what does that mean? Right? Now, that doesn't mean that you become, morbid in any way or concerned with your mortality in a way that you could think of as clinically depressed or anything. It's death is the utmost limit of your existence, but as such, for Heidegger, it's already now. It determines who you are. So he thinks it in a Greek sense. The Greeks think of limit as peras, which is where something begins and not ends. It's where something comes into its own and is free to be itself. But we've externalized death, right? Death is an event that occurs, and if I die, I mean, it might 40, 50 years from now, but I don't have to worry about it. For Heidegger, death in this regard is now. We are always already structurally directed towards it anyways. So what you have to do is to fully sort of pull that into your existence now. And that, he says, will almost immediately eradicate any inauthentic possibility of fashion of the day immediately. It'll make it completely, nothing is important anymore that you think, I need to write a paper and get published in your case, or I need to or the case of an academic, or I need to, climb up the corporate ladder, yada yada. None of that is, or in this country, it's very important to get on the housing ladder, as you might have heard in the UK, right? None of that is important all of a sudden, because how is that an authentic possibility of existence? You're pushing into it, and it doesn't mean that you end up in a blessed state, right? There's no guarantee.
Okay, so you're basically saying that there's a kind of functional relationship between one's nearness to death or orientation towards death, a kind of honest and direct reckoning with the prospect of death, and an authentic life.
Yes.
And so it would also follow that the inauthenticity that characterizes most people at most times is in part based on, or because of, you might even say, their kind of constant neurotic fear of death and kind of running away from the prospect of death.
Yeah, and you could put it. Yeah.
Now, how do you? So a lot of people will interpret this in kind of popular debates about kind of longevity, extension, and stuff like this. And so in a way, people who are obsessed with living really long today are, on one hand, you can think of them as, embracing life and being affirmative and moving forward and kind of fearlessly having disregard for death. But in other ways, they're obviously kind of terrified of death and doing everything they can to avoid it.
Yes.
So there's a bit of I wouldn't call it a contradiction necessarily, but that kind of confuses how someone might interpret what you're saying. In other words, is the drive for life, is vitalism a kind of a fear of death? Because my sense is that there is a kind of authentic, affirmative, healthy kind of vitalism, a kind of lust for life, just true living that has that almost forgets about death. It's not a fear of death, but it's a kind of healthy living disregard of it.
Okay, I'll stick to a certain degree with Heidegger. Fear of death is what the they has, right? Not taking that seriously, etc. That's what happens there. But for Heidegger, just to put this very briefly, by running forth towards death, or pushing yourself into your ownmost possibility, as he calls it, eigenste Möglichkeit, which is unsurpassable, that pushes you back to where you are. That's not being only directed towards death. Death you could think of as the ultimate horizon.
Okay.
Horizon means limit.
Right. So
now, in order to have any direction and sense where you are, where am I going? Oh, I'm going to meet a friend at a bar. I have to have a sense of direction where I'm going, and that's horizontal. So if death is that ultimate horizon, you could say, or at least gives, I would not, to be very picky, gives rise to an ultimate horizon, because death itself is not a horizon. Why? Because it cannot be a projection of a subject. But without such an ultimate horizon, how could you have any other, so like any other authentic and inauthentic possibilities, but also any other horizons within the world light up thanks to running forth towards death. And for Heidegger, it would be someone who's in complete denial of death and trying to extend life. That's the most inauthentic existence you could have. And you're actually, the strange thing about Silicon Valley and all of this, and I've met people who are, who have invested in, is it cryonics? Is that the word for it?
Sure.
Did I mention that? I don't know if I mentioned it in London, but what's so strange about them is that if they are all they think about is death. They want to extend life, first of all, to do what? To watch more Netflix. And then, second of all, what they're focused on is death, but in such an inauthentic way. It's not my death, and I'm going to push it away and further away, but actually all of their lives, their entire focus is on their death that they hate and loathe. And language tells you that there is no word for us mortals to be immortal. We cannot, it's ridiculous. You cannot be immortal without sort of circling around death, mortality still.
Right. So the Heideggerian orientation towards death is not like a constant thinking about it. You don't have to be constantly meditating upon it to have the proper relationship with it, according to Heidegger. But it's more like flinging yourself into life in the most authentic way that you can, something like that. That is a kind of reckoning with death, because it's the idea that, like, if you think of death as your horizon or a horizon, even though I know you just said it's not technically a horizon, but if you're kind of aware of death as a possible ultimate horizon, it does have a way of emboldening you, to choose your words and to choose your actions in a way that is kind of disregarding of short-term contingent social and political pressures. Because if ultimately your true, how should I put it, your true kind of anchor for thinking about what your own priorities and decisions is this kind of radical prospect of death, it does have a way of allowing you to live more fully, or something like that. It's hard to say this without lapsing into stupid cliches.
Yes, you see that, but that's where we are, right?
Yeah.
But that's unfortunately the age we live in, and I think that's en passant, just to mention it. I think that's why Heidegger more and more coins neologisms and speaks in a way that's also non-philosophical and absolutely non-metaphysical, etc. Is because, as he says in a very, very important book called Beiträge zur Philosophie, Contributions to Philosophy, he says that this is a silly title. Contribution to Philosophy is just such a silly title. But if I were to publish this, I can only publish this if I call it Contribution to Philosophy, because that's where we are. And this is, this 80 years ago or so. And he also says that we now have to find a very different language to think about anything, because every philosophical word has become vacuous. But it's like a continuous. I met one of my mentors a couple of weeks ago, and he said, anything written about Nietzsche is just a continuous source for feuilleton writers and the culture page writers. It's everywhere. So philosophy, the strange thing of our age about it is philosophy is everywhere. There's so many Nietzsche books. It's everywhere. You open philosophy here, philosophy there. But then you wonder, are you really going to where it actually hurts, right? And Heidegger certainly does that. And it's by, and exactly, I don't want to sound like as we talked about, like a life coach or something. It's like, just think about if you died tomorrow, what would you do today?
Right.
That's not it, because there is something underneath. I think in being in time, what's going on, it's not, it's still phenomenology. So it's still descriptive. It's describing structures. And it's describing attunements and structures, and those structures happen to be called Dasein, which is not you and me. That's just, Dasein is, as he calls it, the being of the human being. That means presence. And what happens, I think, in being in time, if there's anything transformative about it, is not that it tells you what to do, but it shows you what's going on anyways. So you are, if you like it or not, you are towards your death anyways. And what happens in a profound reading of Being in Time is that it pushes you furthest to death, and what can be realized there, I think, is that being itself withdraws. Is that you don't reach a state where you're finally authentic or something. Is that there is in any presence withdrawal and concealment and refusal is active, right? Heidegger has this notion of being as a draw, a self-concealing draw. There's no trace of being ultimately. And that's the exact opposite of what we are trying to do, or what technology is trying to do, which is having everything perfectly graspable as an object, or at least as an artifact of something that was once real. And then available as such forever, and always in the same way, right? That there's no, it's a very strange period we live in, because it's eradicating time, right?
You were also telling me, Johannes, about different experiences of time, and how there's a kind of homogeneous linear time, but then there's also a kind of heterogeneous, nonlinear, ecstatic time. Would you mind reviewing that idea for me, and take as much time as you want or need?
Yeah, that's it's very strange to talk about ecstatic time, or to write about it, because it might sound completely mad.
We'll just go one step at a time. Why don't you start by helping us help us understand the traditional kind of philosophical conception of homogeneous or linear time. Start with that, and then
the story that Heidegger gives, and that probably is quite accurate, is that time has been conceptualized or understood as linear, and that's true for Aristotle, and that remains true up until this day in most analytical philosophy, for example, where when we think of time is simply the flow of now states. So you move from T1 to T2 to T3. I'm thinking about writing a paper just for fun on a different name, where what happens at T1.5? I don't think that's been done yet, but even when we set the date for this, we agreed on, this is the 6th of April, I think. We agreed on the 6th of April at 4 p.m. UK time. Now, for Heidegger, if linear time, or if time worked purely in a linear fashion, then we could not even make sense of that. How could we make sense of agreeing with someone else to meet? And language is a bit of tricky here at a certain point in time. So language is sort of, it's already talking in a way that it sounds like time is linear. But for Heidegger, to have datability, the fact that we use calendars, etc., and can make sense of that, is only possible if what is to come, that is the future, and that which currently is the present moment, comes from what has been. That there's not now, and then now is just past, and it moves into this container of history that we didn't look at, like it's just data, and then the future is this open nothingness or void. No, there's something else at work. There's anything that is now is structured by what has been in a relationship with what is to come. So there is this continuous wave movement of coming back, right? It's coming back, but that doesn't mean that anything that is to come only comes from the past, because at the same time it breaks open new horizons anyways. Because why? Because being is fissured. There are fissures in being, and that always. So what is to come moves from what has been in a sort of a wavelength like this, and I'm trying to show it with my hands, and then it pushes back into a present moment, and that present moment is to a certain degree what has been, and then pushes itself back again. And Heidegger has, when we speak of time, we say that time passes, and that's obviously true when we think of time as linear. Then it's just now, and another now. But Heidegger asks in Being in Time, and I think that's something that hasn't been picked up yet enough, is Heidegger asks, why don't we think of time as arising? So ecstatic time is fundamentally not passing. Ecstatic time, which is original temporality for Heidegger, is actually arising, and then it makes more sense, right? And if you think that time is arising rather than passing, you've entered a different temporality anyways, and then, for example, facing death or running forth towards death already begins to mean something else as well. If time is arising, then time itself is something that gives. So there's a sense of gifting and a very different way of being present than what all of philosophy tells us. I mean, up until Hegel and especially Nietzsche, it's metaphysics always tries to, in a certain way, eradicate time, and at the same time overcome it and enter eternity. Right? So, for example, now there's just a flow of now states, and therefore eternity is thought of as a standing now, a Nunc-stans, just a standing now. You could think of the internet as a Nunc-stans. It's always, and that's literally what's happening anyways. The reason technically that we can do this right now, because you're in New Jersey, it's 11 a.m. and it's 4 p.m. here, is because time has been flattened online. It needs to be flattened so we can access the same timeline. It needs to be homogenized. So that's working with a linearized version of time, which is derivative for Heidegger, which you could say is inauthentic, etc. But I think for Heidegger, it's possible to enter an ecstatic temporality where and these are some of the strangest things that he's writing on, where you can almost see what's going to happen. And he has this passage in a book on Nietzsche, where he says that, and I'm trying to find the passage now. What we would, I think, call what we would call a déjà vu today is, he says that there are sometimes these dark and strange moments or experiences where we think that whatever's happening right now has already happened. right? These moments we've all been there, but then of course, if you're a natural scientist, that's because your brain is lacking oxygen and therefore it's not processing information quick. And okay, thanks. But for Heidegger, it indicates that which is to come to a certain degree has been. And there are movies being made in that direction. Arrival is an example. I don't know if you've seen that, very recent.
No, I haven't. Oh, yes, I have. Yeah, of course I have. Yeah.
Aliens.
Right.
Arrive. I mean, we could talk. It kind of sounds like someone you've had on your podcast before. Aliens arrive and they have a different temporality. How? By having a non-linear language. Right? Now, when Heidegger, for example, speaks of Ereignis, which is falsely translated as the event, he calls the Ereignis that which comes into its own as it withdraws. That's not a proposition. How do you represent that? That's trying to articulate simultaneity and ecstatic temporality.
So you were saying that increasingly today, it's as if we are trying to flatten time more and more radically, as evidenced by something like the internet. So if that is the case, what would we expect to find? In what way is reality is the true structure of reality going to snap back at us?
That's a good question, if not. Well, there's a word. It's not I think it's from an Italian philosopher called Cino Zaccaria. He calls it what's going on is temposide. So how is reality going to snap back at us? I think it already is.
But how do we interpret that in the lens of ecstatic time, or the nonlinear circular nature of time? Like, is it something like the circle of time is getting compressed? Is it something like that? Is the circular motion of time speeding up? Could we say something like that?
There is. I mean, I don't think that time is a circle. If you want to put it for your listeners or viewers, so they can sort of imagine it a bit. Think of it as waves, and that's very interesting. In another film called Interstellar, they're on a planet where time is speeding up extremely, but it feels very slow to them, and there's huge waves going by, and I think they're trying to show that wave dimension, wave movement of time, of that dimensionality.
Could we just pause on that real quick, because that makes a lot of sense in one way, but then it makes it hard to process how the future kind of cycles with the past, what you were saying before. So if time is a wave-like motion, it's hard to see how the future kind of comes into the present.
Because it doesn't just cycle, right? If you want to put it in there is time is arising, first of all, right? And if so, that's perhaps the fundamental movement, and then what has been properly is always already factoring through that which is, in a way that it's coming towards us, but that's not circular. There is still this arising movement or turning of time itself that opens certain realms of projection within which appearance is possible. And so that's how you make sense of who you were before, for example, right? Okay,
that's good. So you can carry on then. Sorry to interrupt.
Yes. And you asked before how it's sort of already messing with us.
Well, what I was asking was if the conventional notion of time is wrong, and there is this kind of Heideggerian structure of time that is the true model, and we, in our conventional state as human beings, in our kind of modern technological mindset, which Heidegger talks a lot about and thinks a lot about, if we are operating on ourselves in a way that is out of sync with the true nature of time, and we're becoming increasingly aggressive about flattening time, for instance, what would Heidegger's philosophy teach us to expect is going to be the kind of the resulting consequences on the level of reality?
A breakdown of meaning on levels that are even worse than now. And this is the laughter of despair. But it's you can see, I think, what I'm trying to say. I mean, would you agree that we are continuously living through non-linear events, right? I mean, that linearity of time doesn't seem to make much sense anymore. That, for me, that's just a certain sense. Someone with, your extreme, as I said when we first talked, extreme hyper-analytical mind, you can give like proper empirical examples. I'm really bad at that. But what I'm reading all over the internet everywhere is, there's something very strange happening. Economies will become non-linear. And we've lived in this very strange Keynesian bubble for the past 80 years, which, let's just print all the money we can, because in X amount, and by the way, Keynes himself thought that by the 1920s, we would actually have, by using usury, interestingly, to its absolute maximum and be really evil about money and greed, we could reach a state where we could live forever without doing anything, just live off the substance that we created before. And that's a very linear understanding of time. And the way that governments work, the way that national economies, or also the global economy works, is purely linearly. But it's not working anymore. So they have to invent all of these terrible, weird, synthetic nonsense, like negative interest rates and very cheap debt at very high interest rates, just to keep everything going. But it doesn't seem to really function properly anymore. And maybe you have better examples than me. But the way it'll come back at us is precisely by a breakdown of meaning, or the way we have tried to make meaning of the world as it is.
Right. It's almost as if the result might be that being increasingly escapes us, right? It's increasingly foreclosed to us, something like that.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, yes. And what does that mean? Is that's nothing mystical, or that's not God or anything. It's just everything feels a bit empty.
Yes. And people have a hard time even accessing some kind of state or project or tendency that gets them feeling like they're even making any progress toward a more kind of true state of being, right? It's like severe alienation seems to be really locked in for very large numbers of people.
Yeah.
Myself included, possibly. I mean, who knows? I'm not putting myself above that.
Probably we're the worst of it.
Is that a kind of Heideggerian upshot of all of this, in the sense that is Heidegger's philosophy a way to understand how we've become so alienated? Is it something about the structure of time and the structure of being that we have significantly misunderstood? And we have, as a civilization, have made a series of wagers on essentially wrong interpretations of who we are and the structure of reality. But now we're locked into those wagers. They're increasingly kind of self-fulfilling prophecies that operate over and above us. And it's almost as if we are watching ourselves become ineluctably farther and farther away from access to our own being.
Yeah, there's so much in that, because when you say locked in, I think of the cave, right? So there's so much that I want to address now because of what you said. I think that's exactly it. And watching ourselves, we're literally watching ourselves. We are watching. Why are we watching ourselves all the time? What is that? Why are we doing that? Because we have no sense of who and where we are. And now the strangest thought maybe is that we're not very old. Right now, with the explosion of over the past 500 years, the world's going to end in 10. What is it now? 5 billion years, whatever the amount of years it is. Then the sun implodes, and it goes back that amount of years back until the Big Bang, which is sort of Genesis without God. But and then in between you get dinosaurs and blah blah blah. But none of that matters. None of that matters for us at all, because we have to make sense of who we are now. And thinking itself, as far as we can trace it in terms of textual evidence, etc., is only about, in the way that it has now spread globally, is only about 2,500 years old. And that is, Heidegger is very, very, very I mean, he's almost like accusing Europe all the time. He's saying, what is happening? We are Europeanizing the world. It's planetary, but we don't even know who we are anymore. We haven't even figured out who we are. So on the one hand, there's a great sense of despair in Heidegger, that we've kind of lost what was going on, but that wasn't lost with Descartes or anyone. There's already beginning to lose power with Plato. We can talk about concealing and concealment here, then, how to understand Heidegger better, because that's what he thinks metaphysics forgets. Right? That's its limit is self-concealing. But on the other hand, thinking is very young, so it's only just beginning. So there is, even though it's a very desolate age, as he quotes Hölderlin, who locked himself in a tower for about 20 years, or was locked in as well for some time, is that kind of so there is still hope, you could say, for a future thinking, for a different way of thinking, that will appreciate what we have forgotten, and very much so have forgotten in the Occident or in the Western world. We are the Western world is that culture or civilization of objectification. It's not. No one else is doing that. It starts with us.
Right. So, Johannes, I'm most familiar with Heidegger's writings on technology. I've taught them a little bit. And there's this idea in Heidegger about how modern technology makes us relate to the world in a way that sees everything around us as what he calls standing reserve.
Bestand.
And it's basically, to put it very crudely, we tend to see things just as objects to be used for some other purpose. And he talks about, in the question concerning technology, about the risk or the prospect of reaching a point where we start to see ourselves as standing reserve and each other as standing reserve. And I forget the lines, but I get the impression from that text that he seemed to fear a distinct possibility that at a certain threshold where we saw ourselves as standing reserve, that we could kind of reach a threshold in which we become once and for all kind of foreclosed to ourselves. He seemed that was my impression anyway. He seemed to fear a particular kind of catastrophic juncture like that could arise. Is that your reading, or am I missing something?
Yes, I could give you the standard academic response, which I think you're right. There's a tension in Heidegger. Thinking works by tensions, right? That's why we're not interested in contradictions, I think, to both of us. But yes, I think that impression is absolutely accurate. He does fear that being could abandon us for good. But that would no longer be a human world, and it would not be recognizable. We would enter the age of machines. He does say that in a text on language.
So my fear is that, what if we've already crossed that threshold?
How would we? Well, okay, I can. There's another way of looking at Heidegger. It's okay. That's a good question, but within Heidegger, it's he doesn't. There is no ultimate eschatology or teleology. He doesn't. If you look purely at the logic of his, or the structures of his thinking, there isn't. He doesn't say that the Gestell, positionality, or enframing, as it's translated, is eternal. And he does say also that the Geviert, so the gathering of the four poles of divinity, or gods, sky, earth, and mortals, us, is that's proper world, and we can talk about that also. That is actually only lighting up is only possible at the same time as positionality is possible. So as this is speeding up and becoming more and more invasive, and showing its true nature to more and more people, right, who are not completely gone. You can see it more and more what's going on. That's when all of a sudden there can be a breakdown within it, because being is still fissured, and another something else is returning. And that returning is a world for human beings that lights up in something very simple like a bridge, right? But Heidegger's certainly not saying like the Hubert Dreyfus, who's an American Heidegger scholar, who'd say, let's just drink tea like the Japanese and everything will be fine. No, we cannot. The weird thing is that we cannot sort of will anything. We cannot will for something else to come about. What we can do, and that's because we're mortal and finite beings, is that we have to respond to something, to what's going on, in a different way than we've responded to it before. So none of this is something you can just change and say, oh, I'm going to face death and then I'm going to be more authentic and not use technology. That's not what he's saying either. There's something, it's all about how we respond to it. So on the one hand, he's saying being is completely withdrawing, being is completely refusing itself. But on the other hand, that's exactly how being works, right? So if that utter withdrawal is all of a sudden showing itself, that's actually for Heidegger, that's a great chance, because all of a sudden that withdrawal shows itself. Right. So now we can begin to respond to it differently. And that's just planting in the seeds for generations to come.
Right. So he talks about the supreme danger and how the supreme danger is also the saving power.
Yeah. By the way, I just just reminded me of something else, and how we've sort of already eradicated time to a certain degree. We don't have to respect seasons anymore. I mean, we don't. Human beings always had to. Now we don't have to do that anymore. Not really. We can just grow everything at any time, anywhere.
Or night and day.
Right? This kind of planetary thinking of you can just build any building anywhere, and it won't lead to any problems. You can have roads everywhere. It's so pervasive. It's unfortunately it's not leaving much room. And there are moments in Heidegger where he says it has to get a lot worse. It'll be absolutely terrible and dire for centuries to come. We'll just be workers. Value will be extracted from us. There's absolutely no goal. That's a quote from Heidegger. There's a will to will that works by an anarchy of catastrophes, but it uses that's a quote from Heidegger. Can you imagine? But that anarchy is portrayed as sort of the triumphant human subject that now controls the earth, and we call it, of course, the Anthropocene. So I would still think, though, that there is for Heidegger still an opening, and there is an opening precisely when being withdraws the most it ever has, maybe.
Wow, yeah, that's great. That's a really good point. I do kind of recall that now, how he talks about, although you get the impression he thinks we might be on the threshold of kind of irrevocable disaster. He also, he makes that point. I think he quotes Holderlin as a citation for this insight, that it's precisely the realization of that supreme danger that we gain a kind of access to precisely what we might be looking for.
Yes, I mean, only then. And this is why thinking is very young.
Right.
It's only just beginning. But once the Gestell, right, techniques in its essence has nothing to do with metaphysics. It's a very bad translation. The Wesen der Technologie, Wesen der Technik, means something like the dimensionality within which something occurs in a certain way. For example, beings now occur as standing reserve. That the fact that this has shown itself to Heidegger means that it's already shifting. There are shifts occurring. Right? Because being is ultimately fissured, and we're always dancing in the abyss anyway. So we're always one step in chaos, one step in logos. But that's a bit like Jordan Peterson or something. but the fact that he can see it and call it a Gestell means that something is shifting. And it's shifting very slowly, but that creates an opening. And that opening creates a way of responding to it. So nothing is lost, right? I mean, you've given up when you present an eschatology. You say, this is anyway how it's going to happen. There's something arriving from the future, and we can do nothing about it. That's apocalyptic thinking without God. So for Heidegger, certainly there is something at work that's not human, and there is something arriving that's not human. But it's a question of how we respond to it. And actually, it's a great chance, because if linearity is breaking apart as it's doing, and also as it's doing in technology, then we can finally leave that matrix of linear temporality that's keeping us, to a certain degree, locked in ourselves, and then seeing something else.
That's beautiful. That's very, very based. I appreciate that.
I still don't know what that means, but
it means good, basically. So we have a question from Crypt. Big ups to Crypt for $3 Canadian. Thank you very much, sir. The question is, do you have any thoughts on the economization of synthetic time? Now, that itself is a little cryptic, but I think I know what he's getting at a little bit. I know that you're not a major reader of Nick Land, Johannes, but Nick Land did write his dissertation on Heidegger. I forget the details, but it was at least to some degree about Heidegger. And there's this idea coming out of Nick Land that Bitcoin represents this kind of profound moment in the history of philosophy. He thinks that Bitcoin is what he calls a truth machine, and that what's going on there is a economization of synthetic time. I'm just going to leave that very cryptic and open-ended for you to just basically, would you like to riff on that in any way whatsoever? Does that kind of make you think of anything in the Heideggerian perspective?
Well, you could almost say what's happening with time is something that's extremely strange in that regard, that you can turn it into something. And that's maybe what he's getting at there, right? Is that it's becoming an object, if you like, of use. And that's, to a certain degree, I would say that comes about as well from the way we've thought of time for a long time, which is to say, let's do this now. That's going to save us time. How do you save time? Where is it? Where is it going? It's this kind of, you cannot.
Right.
I mean, I don't want to say too much of quantification of time, etc. But if you think of time if you begin to think about time from the clock, from the watch, right, from clock time, then that obviously must lead in an age like ours to an economization or commodification of time. Yes, but that's not time. It's not, and if it's called synthetic time, then it's just not time at all. It still has an effect on us because we are these very strange beings who, by the way we respond to what's calling us all the time, and even if we don't respond, we've responded, right? Even if with indifference, then we've responded, because if we say, no, this doesn't concern me, then that's a response. And that feeds back into that realm of possibility that is being. And then that just shoots flashes again, Heraclitus says, right? The flash of being that comes back at us. And by the way, Heraclitus also says, we're always listening to the logos, we're always hearing the logos, but we're never listening to it. Not everyone is. So that's what Heidegger says as well. So in that way, yes, synthetic time can structure our experience, which is ultimately what it means to be human, is to have experiences, right? And be in a certain spatio-temporal occurrence, and then try to make sense of that. But that doesn't mean that that's the ultimate sort of way of understanding time. It's just an understanding of time that is in itself limited. It begins from the wrong assumptions. It begins from the assumption that time is a clock, or that you can measure time in that way.
Interesting. So you were saying that to the degree you're saving or storing time, then it's not really time.
No, where is it?
Well, I think the idea is that Bitcoin, blockchain more generally, has some very peculiar properties in which it essentially creates its own time. It because it basically has this kind of intrinsic clocking system. I think Nick Land calls it absolute succession. It doesn't draw on anything outside of itself for its own clock, basically. That it is in some sense time itself, but you can basically bootstrap it yourself. You can make a bunch of blockchains, right? You can basically kind of create these artificial time systems that are totally self-clocking and self-sustaining, I think is the idea. So I'm just curious if that resonates.
Is that actually already happening?
What's that?
So that's how blockchain works then.
I think Nick Land seems to think that Bitcoin is sort of the technological discovery in which the creation of these synthetic time machines finally becomes technologically instantiated.
Okay. I would say that that's a certain response to how time has been interpreted. Because if you say succession, I hear linearity, right? So it's a natural, you could almost say, response, consequential, out of how we've understood time for the most part of how we've been thinking in a European way, and that's the result. That's one of the results of it. But it doesn't like how this kind of, does science find reality or not? That's basically what this is getting at as well. And if within a transcendental framework, that did not exist before we did. If you stick with Kant, then that was not there before we found it, because it's still idealism. So I think that's just human beings always respond, and that's one way of responding to how time has been thought of for the most part of our history of thinking. But it certainly is not the only way of responding to that problem.
Right. Okay. That's all very interesting. That's enough for that. We don't need to dwell on that for too long. Thank you for entertaining questions that you don't necessarily have any particular interest or background in. So, Johannes, could you tell me a little bit more about something you told me when we were hanging out about the community of mortals? What is the community of mortals?
What is the community?
I know you're highly offended by my vulgar and direct questioning.
No, I'm not. Obviously not. No. It's before I can say anything about that, I need to say what Heidegger speaks about this.
Sure.
So there is a series of talks that he gives in the 50s and I think also in the 60s on technology. But at the same time, he also talks about the Geviert, the gathering of the four, as it's translated as a fourfold. And he said those are talks entitled Building, Dwelling, Thinking, or Das Ding, the thing. And so you cannot separate sort of his trying to understand technology or techniques from his vision or the possibility he sees of the fourfold. And within the world that he calls fourfold, there is what he says is something very strange. He says that mortals are those who can die, and that we have to become mortals. That's another very strange claim, because from a scientific point of view, death is just the end of life. It's, cells stop splitting or whatever else happens, and then off you go. Or the brain stops working. I guess for the most part, death is now about the brain, isn't it? For Heidegger to say that Heidegger actually does say we're not even mortal yet. So we haven't even accomplished that yet. That's still something to come. And the German is Sterbliche sind die den Tod als Tod vermögen. Now the standard translation that your listeners will find in the English translations is something like mortals are those who are capable of death as death. And that sounds first of all, it's wrong. But second of all, if that was what Heidegger meant, that would sound very, very strange, right? To be capable of death as death, what does that mean? To be operate with it somehow? No, Vermögen, you can hear mögen, which means to like, to love. Vermögen means something has addressed me. And I have dared to respond to it in a proper way. So when he's saying death as death, what does that mean? Death. Why the hermeneutical as? What, right? Why do you have to open something up here? Why not just death? Because death for Heidegger, after the war, he begins to call death the Gebirg des Seins, and that means the mountain range of being, or the gathering of concealment. So we need to talk about concealment a bit. So what he's saying when he's saying, die Sterblichen sind diejenigen, die den Tod als Tod vermögen. Mortals are those who are addressed by death and then dare to respond to it. If death then here means Gebirg, which is the topic of my book, then that means that mortals must respond to concealment, to concealing. And that's the workings of time ultimately as well, right? So we need to begin to think after the withdrawal and refusal in any occurrence and appearance, rather than trying to do the exact opposite, which is trying to latch on and live in a world of sheer availability and Bestand of standing reserve. And that's upon us. So that's how we are still free, is by responding to it differently. And that means by appreciating that in any opening, in any disclosing, withdrawal and concealment are active, right? And so the community of mortals, if you're asking what that would look like, I think that, and these are not just extremely abstract notions. Heidegger mentions that almost like sacred places in a village, for example, or in a community, where you would have one room where children are being born, and right next to it you would have the room where people are allowed to die. And that in itself is already very different from how we think of death, because for us it's it's sanitized and it's outsourced, and it's a very gross business if you've ever been to a hospital where this happens on a daily basis. People die alone in a sanitized, over-hygienized environment where there's almost nothing left that could put you. I mean, I don't know if you've ever seen a dead body or been with someone who you've had loved before, and you see them there lying dead. There's something very, very peculiar about that. There's something that pulls you down. It's not about being sad or anything, but there's something opening up. There's something opening up in when you see someone really leave this earth, and maybe then going back in it. And so the community of mortals would be a welcoming into life by birth, right? But at the same time being mindful that what life in a community is about is to make it possible for every one of its members to be sent away, to be let go in a way that they can let go, and they want to let go, and they are cherished. And that's why do we lack that to an extreme. In Germany, for example, just to give a very practical example for once, within 10 years or so, they dig you out of your grave and put someone else in there. You're gone, right? And it's not about keeping the memory up or anything. But it's about the a total denial of death. It's just this external thing that sometimes happens, but it certainly doesn't happen to me. It would never happen to me. How could it happen to me? How could it happen to my loved ones? And all of a sudden it happens, but it doesn't. You can read these stories like, it didn't fit my life plan. It didn't fit in. So you fall. I mean, there are cases of my mother is a psychologist. She's got people in therapy who she's had people in therapy who all of a sudden started suffering from cancer. They lost all of their friends because they couldn't compete anymore, right? You can say, oh, they're bourgeois, blah, blah. But in a community of mortals, that would not be an issue, because what is cherished here is that your presence itself is only possible thanks to, and it's important that I say thanks to, that has to do with thanking, thanks to something that's already concealing itself.
So this is a matter of how we think of concealment.
Yes, I mean, ultimately, if with Heidegger, it's very interesting. With Heidegger, that there's the extreme, you could say almost like abstract way of thinking, but then it breaks down to something very, very simple. And I think that Heidegger is here very close to Rilke, and he certainly read a lot of Rilke. For Rilke, death is the other side of life. Death is the other side of being. Death is, in the elegy, Rilke says that death is our friend. Death is our friend, and every adult, an adult is someone for Rilke who's able to let death grow within him. Right, and it sounds morbid in our age. It's just born to die or living to die. No, but you cannot escape that one reality, which is your death. You cannot escape it. So rather than externalizing it, you internalize it and you let it grow with you. That's how you become an adult. So a community of mortals is, in that Rilkean sense, then an adult community that's completely faced up to the naked and tragic reality that all of us will die.
Right. So the community of mortals is characterized by a collective will to think death, to think that which is concealed, in a way that is different than kind of normal, conventional social groups, which generally are all about kind of acting as if they're not going to die, social competition, and this kind of charade that dominates.
It binds you together, right? Because you mentioned social competition. It's a very different language from Heidegger, obviously. But yes, I mean, that's something I've never thought of, is why do we compete in such a, brutal and awful way for nothing? I mean, we're not competing really for anything. We're competing literally over bullshit.
Yeah.
Owning more shit, but not owning yourself. Like, owning who you are is not part of that. Right? Why? Maybe it is because there's nothing that binds us together anymore. And maybe that we've talked about alienation before. And through the community of mortals, they're bound together by that insight into the tragic truth that we will die. Incipit tragedia. Tragedy begins. Nietzsche says that, Heidegger quotes him quite often on that. And it only just begins. And it only just begins, especially in an age where God is dead. There is no hope. There's no afterlife. There's nothing that could save you. Anything that happens in Silicon Valley, all of this nonsense of transhumanism and uploading yourself to the cloud, which first of all reduces you just to your base desires. And second of all, that's just neo-Christianity.
So I'm curious, does Heidegger drop any hints about how the community of mortals is perceived by the community of non-mortals outside of the community of mortals? And the reason I ask, I'm just curious, is because there's this idea in Deleuze and Guattari about becoming imperceptible, and something I've actually been focusing on it in the past few days. I've been writing some things about it because I have a few things to say about it. And there's this idea that, to use, a Heideggerian vocabulary that they don't use at all. I have this sense that truly authentic living, and especially kind of collective relationships that are authentic, have a peculiar property of being illegible to those who are outside of it, especially those who are kind of locked in the das Man or the they. Are there any hints of that idea? Like, how does the community of mortals get perceived by everyday people?
I think that's a very good question. I think that Heidegger, there's a conversation that you can actually find on YouTube that Heidegger had with a Buddhist monk, where he points out in his very spitzbübische way. So he's almost like a little boy sometimes still, but he turns around and says, so in that sense, every human being is mad, verrückt, beyond himself, transcending. I think that a group like that would be perceived as utterly mad.
Right, that's right. And you know what this also makes me think about is how Heidegger is known for using a very dense and difficult language. Yeah. And I believe he's quite explicit about why that is. I think he believes, if I recall correctly, that one has to adopt this particularly difficult, some might even say esoteric kind of technical language, precisely because the nature of being is constantly eluding us, and using kind of everyday language will constantly fail to get at what one is trying to get at. So I wonder, is there some sort of relationship here also to the esoteric, almost to the use of languages and vocabularies that are almost need to be obscure? Is there something going on there?
Well, it depends on, it might sound very obscure to a non-German ear. I will say this: whenever I travel back home, and I just went back home a couple of weeks ago, and my father picked me up from the airport, and we went through. So I'm from Augsburg. My father's from a village called Brettriching, very close to Landsberg in Bavaria. And when you in that region, when you hear people talk, and the accent is, I can try and it'll be very contrived, but it'll sound a bit like it. And I'll actually say something Heideggerian. I'll say something: the earth is that which conceals itself. Die Erde verbirgt sich selbst. So you hear that there's a very, like, the R is very strong and rough. When you hear people talk, still, the elderly, who still have a proper dialect, not an accent or these movie German, television German accents, but actually speak in a dialect, vernacular. Then very often, when I come back from the empire, I realize that it is not that obscure. Actually, it isn't that obscure, because this is how Heidegger, how it would make immediate sense to someone who is, speaks in a dialect in that region. It would make sense. It makes less and less sense maybe the further north you go in Germany, and the more you translate it to another language. But then on the other hand, it's what he says about philosophy and its language. He does say, if philosophy makes itself understandable, that's suicide. I'm paraphrasing. He does say that as well, right? So it's so on the one hand, that notion of Bergen and Verbergen, etc., that's very close to at least from the sound of it, to how, so that sense or meaning discloses itself to me, at least more so when I'm in these regions. But I think your question is trying to get at whether such a community must be esoteric and closed off from others.
Or not necessarily closed off, but doesn't it follow from what you're saying that the community of mortals would want to evade being legible or classifiable or interpretable according to the categories and the schema of people outside the community of mortals? Wouldn't that actually be an active concern in some sense?
Yes, I would agree.
Because there's always this pressure, and I feel like this is one of the pressures pulling us back always into the Das Man of explaining yourself to other people. and of trying to justify yourself to people that are outside of your community. But my intuition has always been, and I wonder if I can find Heideggerian support for this, because it sounds like I can, that the authentic person, and especially the authentic person who is invested in an authentic community, has no need to care whatsoever about how that community is perceived outside of that community. And in fact, it would be a characteristic trait of the authentic community to be purposefully and actively contemptuous of being understood by people outside of the community.
Yes, and even indifferent, right? You don't need to make I mean, language is not communication, right? It's not necessary that everyone understands it. And Heidegger, Heidegger, of course, he was then accused of being esoteric and whatnot, and you're not making this understandable, blah blah blah, by people like Habermas and others. No one blames scientists or technicians for creating computers. Do you know how to operate a computer? I have no idea how this thing works. I'm using it. So, and Heidegger makes that example. He says that there are probably 4 people in the world today who can explain how a radio works. Everybody's using it. So this thinking, he says, for now, is in the Sache. So in its, like, what's at stake in it. That's very simple. That's not a difficult thing to think, right, for him. But in performing that thinking, that's difficult, and actually living it, you could say that's very difficult, and only for a few. But he doesn't say that it stops here. It could go to spread, etc.
So my next question then is, and this was raised in the chat, by the way, also, but I'm quite interested in it myself. Where does God come into the picture?
Oh yeah, only a God can save us now, right? I mean, that was probably
well, in particular, the idea of a return of God.
So Heidegger says in the Spiegel interview, which is the last interview he officially gave, and was published after his death, which has also the title "Nur ein Gott kann uns jetzt noch retten," only a God can save us now. I guess he doesn't. So that's not the Christian God. That there is, however, as long as we are mortals and finite beings, and not sort of, as he calls it, monsters of machinic monsters. He does say that's a bit of a paraphrase, but he does say, as long as that's not who we are, that's not who we've become, there is necessarily an openness for gods or the divine to come. And now, there's no mythology. He doesn't name the gods. They don't have, if you like, a function or anything. But what they are is ultimately, they are, again, as they are on the level of sky, is that when to put this in a non-Heideggerian way, you look up to the heavens, and what we see now is just an ever-expanding void. Right, where we hope that aliens could come and that would somehow give us meaning. Probably not. but there are still, tribes and peoples on this very planet who, when they look up, they see an ultimate horizon. That means meaning. That sky where they live gives them orientation, because it gives them meaning, which means it tells them stories. The sky has always told us stories. I live in a city, as you know, London, where they're building one hideous skyscraper after another. And these skyscrapers are, I don't know, remember the Shard?
Sure, yeah.
So, I mean, anyone who knows English knows what Shard means. I don't have to explain that. I mean, it literally
is like that. It is like that.
It looks unfinished. That's postmodernism in a building, right? It's unfinished. It's cutting into the sky. It wants to just literally break open that and cut it open and get rid of it, right?
Right.
But so if you're asking for divinities. It's an experience, and that's an original experience, and that's how Heidegger, or primordial in that sense. That it could be possible, and I think it still is possible, that you look up the sky, even in a place like London, maybe, who knows, and you begin to see that there's something at work larger than you that you're always already responding to, and that you give, that all you do is co-respond with that, and you give answers to it, and that could lead to a mythology, etc. Heidegger does, leaves that open. But without that, what you do is you're a desiring machine. There's no story that guides you. There's nothing that could tell you who you are, except for, I mean, why do we have these, I mean, in a way that kind of a hope by many people that aliens will finally arrive. I mean, that's a bit like, could supreme beings come and give us,
right? Like, how is that any more rational than believing in God? But it's also just dumber.
Yeah, well, you kind of answered that yourself. It's not about rationality. That would be, I mean, I haven't thought about that, but we cannot become gods, right? So that's still the difference between aliens would still be the same kind of life forms that we are, carbon-based, etc., and then more advanced. That's usually how the story goes, extremely advanced, but they're not, as it were, our limits. They're not, on one hand, a mirror of who we are, and on the other hand, a guideline of how we should be, maybe. But it's not even about, for Heidegger, it's not about morality and anything like that anyways.
Okay.
Is there an openness to appreciate that there is something at work that's not us, that then gives us, that we respond to, and that gives us meaning, if that makes sense?
Yeah, absolutely. So the appropriate attitude then to Heidegger is just an openness to the possibility of God returning, because there is this kind of clear blue sky that we don't know and can't know, and it's a kind of absolute openness. It is, in some sense, that is what it is. And so there's the appropriate way to be open to a future of unconcealment would be something like the possibility of God unconcealing itself.
Yes. Yes. I guess I would agree. But and also, though, I mean, if we're with unconcealment or disclosing, maybe we should move in that direction.
Sure, please.
This is how Heidegger understands truth. He goes back to the Greek word already in Being in Time, which is aletheia, or I think the proper Greek pronunciation would be something like aletheia. And Lethe was the river of forgetting in Greek mythology in Hades. And lantano means I forget or I conceal. And the alpha is not negative, but privative. So truth for Greeks, as you know, means for Heidegger unconcealment. But in a way that, so in Being in Time, he's not quite there yet. It's quite interesting when he makes he gives the example of Newton's laws of physics. He says the Newtonian laws, they were at work, but what we now call Newtonian laws, they were at work before Newton, but they had not been disclosed yet. Therefore, they were not true yet. They became true in the moment they were disclosed. But at the same time, when those laws are, shown to be at work in nature, that closes off other possibilities of being. And that's what we forget, right? When we think in science works as it assumes, purely accumulatively. So it's just all accumulation. The more we know, the better we get. 2019, so it's going to be much better next year, but still pretty good now, given that we've survived the Y2K and everything, right? The pending apocalypse. But that's always also there, which is also very strange, because actually that projection of the implosion of the sun is the apocalypse. But for Heidegger, is the insight is, and perhaps it's very profound, perhaps it's just obvious, is that anything that's disclosed, for example, in a scientific finding, closes off other ways of possibility. Other possibilities of being. And so, for example, by Newtonian laws and Kant's transcendental logic, they make possible that we fly airplanes. But they also cover over how we could be in the world and with nature in a very different way. Because, as you know, with Kant, the categories of the subject form the objectivity of the object, yada, yada. Here we are, we make the world the way we want it to be. And for Heidegger, in a lecture course given in 1930 or 31 on truth in Plato's analogy of the cave, he focuses more and more on concealment. So in Being in Time, it's still more about unconcealment and disclosure, but in the later text, it's more and more about concealment. And this is where Heidegger begins, right? Being in Time is not even that important. Being in Time is such a very strange text because it actually doesn't work. It's like he's trying to be a Husserlian phenomenologist and a Neo-Kantian and also a bit Aristotelian. It's all over the place, and then it collapses a bit and it doesn't continue. Because I think he's already bordering very often on the withdrawal of being itself. And so he begins as a thinker. He's ignited as a thinker. His thinking begins when he realizes Verbergung, concealing. That all of a sudden. And then there's been 100 volumes, I think, so far published. And that's just the published works. And they're usually about that size. How is it that one man in 40 years writes that much? Because as he says, it's not me. I'm not writing. It is writing in me. He says that very often. He said it to his brother several times. And what's going on here is that what metaphysics has necessarily left in the dark is now all of a sudden coming to the fore more and more. And Heidegger has to think through it. So he's looking at the history of metaphysics and sees that there's always something at work that is the concealing and self-withdrawal and refusal of being. And he makes that explicit in the cave story. So the usual, I think, interpretation of the cave, you could find probably tons of videos of that on YouTube, is that people, as if some people know, there are prisoners in a cave, but they don't know that they are prisoners, and they're in shackles, I think, and they look at what we would now call, interestingly, a screen. And one of them accidentally is freed, and it's you, and then walks up and sees that people are carrying torches and these figures made of clay, and actually what they've been looking at all this time was shadows. And he walks out again, and he says, oh, there's the sun, there's an actual tree, and it's truth and light of truth. And he walks back down, so he sees that shadows aren't real. And that's it's just educational. What Plato's really trying to say is that don't believe what you see for yourself. Don't trust anything in the media. Now, of course, today it's some people understand it as conspiratorial, that the media is always working against us and that they're not showing us reality. Reality just means thingliness. I don't even know what that's supposed to mean. I mean, if the media is not showing us reality, it's because they can't. Like, literally, they cannot, because how could they? It's just a medium. So necessarily, they cannot show you reality. This just
right. So the cave is a much deeper problem, you're saying.
If that was the problem, why would you even read it? I mean, any 5-year-old can tell you that maybe something isn't always what it seems.
So really, what's at stake is a more kind of primordial embeddedness in the cave.
What's at stake is the turning of being itself. What's at stake is the very origin of any kind of history. What's at stake is that what you're looking at, the shadows, they are real. I mean, why am I saying is they're not unreal. They're real because it structures the world of these people, right? So they're genuine, but they're not real. So they're a seeming reality. So real is, I could be very facetious and say they're real because they are still things, right?
The shadows, that is.
Yeah, but the shadows are in that sense, they are beings that are not, that only seem to be. So right. They are
really something. They are really there, but they're not what you think they are.
Yes, but they are right.
They are truly there. Yes,
but they are, and they're not just there. Socrates, the character Socrates or Plato, describes it as they're memorizing the order of these shadows, and then the person who's capable of memorizing that correctly and then spitting it out again, oh, you win a prize, which you can say that's how our educational system works. Maybe it does, but that just says that the world, and it is a world in which these people live, is structured by that horizon of what we would now call a screen. So it's very much, it's real. It's their reality.
Right.
And by walking up, Heidegger points out that Plato here uses in Greek apparently the word alethes quite often. So that would be the adjective of aletheia. There are moments of alethes, of unconcealings, of disclosings. Of one of them, of course, is when he starts seeing the torches and the clay figures. But no, these are real, right? I mean, there's nothing that's fake about it. But once you're outside the cave and you look into the sun, it's described, I think, by Plato also as painful. So it's not, because the Enlightenment, the way, I mean, we live in a very, the Enlightenment values, we have to keep them. Enlightenment is something that's not, I mean, the French Revolution, is this freedom, kill people? But you look at the sun, it's an extremely painful, disorienting experience. It's because not because you realize that what you've seen so far is false, but because your eyes are not made out for that utter disclosure. But then, interestingly, why doesn't Plato stop there and say the guy just yells down and says, "Come on out"? That could have been the end of the story. Come on out, and a few people follow him and just leave the rest in the cave. No, what happens is he goes back in. Why does he go back in? Why? Because there is no exit from the cave. There isn't. So Nick Land is right on that regard. You go back in, and all of a sudden, for the first time then, by bringing the light of the sun back down into the cave, you start to see the shadows as shadows. As shadows. They begin to light up as the appearance of something that they're not, only then. But Heidegger says that even though Plato is aware here of the concealment that's primordial, he forgets, or but that's not, so when Heidegger says that we've forgotten being, or that Plato has forgotten being, it's not that Plato is at fault or is that he was wrong or something. It's just that the way he responded to being itself was in that way, and that has led to certain outcomes in history. But what's forgotten is that unconcealing in the way up, and that means concealment is forgotten, and it's now the sun remains established as the light of truth that always guides everything and orders everything, as dynamis, as Plato says, it orders all beings. But the way to get there from concealment, that's been forgotten. And we've continuously have now live in the world of sheer availability, and a standing reserve is almost like a result of that, not causalistic, but it is certainly as a result of how we understand what it means to be. Is that everything stands ready and available. But that's sort of the as he calls it, that's the first beginning of thinking. And the other beginning is directed towards a future that is then open, but only open, properly open, by going through what has been and thinking that which has not been thought properly in metaphysics. So it's metaphysics always already borders on that. So for example, very interesting, Kant in the first critique says that there's conditions, but at some point you have to say it's unconditional. And that is the abyss for human reason. And Heidegger says to that, again in this book, that we have to get serious about the abyss in Kant's thinking. And this is what Heidegger does. He thinks through where metaphysics stops short. That's where Heidegger enters.
Okay. So there is no exit from the cave, but what we can do is think unconcealment, or think concealment, I should say.
Yes.
To be constantly thinking about what is concealed is the closest we can get to perhaps not exiting the cave, but accessing moments of disclosure.
Yes, moments is very good. The Augenblick, right? The blink of an eye, the Kairos that then lights up. And those are exit is a very, very dangerous notion anyways, because it suggests that there is really a cave and there's really a door somewhere.
Right.
And then people start looking for something. I mean, and when Heidegger speaks of original thinking, people think, oh, he means going back 2,000 years to we were all peasants and everything was beautiful. No, original thinking can overcome you any given moment that you're open to it. And an exit is the way we respond to something. So the way we respond right now in our epoch to the demands of technology, which work through how, as you would put it, probably, how we socially compete with each other. All of that, how we respond to that opens up possibilities of being, if we just respond to it in the inauthentic, usual way,
right,
we are closing ourselves off from who we could be and from forming proper, genuine, healthy communities.
Right. It's like how Deleuze says that nomads never travel, that escape doesn't require going anywhere. And that in fact, people who are constantly going on adventures and voyages are often the ones who are not truly nomadic. They're not truly escaping anything. They're actually the ones lost in, their mother or their daddy or whatever it might be.
The millennial generation, right? It's traveling a lot.
But it's a very similar structure of ideas there.
I would just say the crucial difference between someone like Deleuze and Heidegger is that Heidegger is in line with Odysseus and Master Eckhart. The ground figure of the European human being is Odysseus. Why? Because Odysseus leaves his home, goes to war, right, and then tries to return and make it back home, but comes home. Master Eckhart, there's a quote, I don't quite know where it is. Gadamer quotes him in a speech he gave in honor of Paul Nator. Paul Nator was a neo-Kantian in Marburg at the time of Heidegger. And Eckhart said, "Warum geht ihr aus, heimzukehren?" So why do you go out to return home? And that is true for Heidegger also. That's true for him as well. So it is about coming back home. If we're talking about escaping or getting out, to talk about this in terms of technology, is Heidegger has an essay on language, a passage where he says, in order to get to return to where there is the possibility of a human world, we need to return to where we are. So you see, that's the strange thought, because that's contradictory. No, it's not dialectical. The movement is a turning, and that's always simultaneous. Always simultaneous. It's never linear. It's always simultaneous. So we are already where we're supposed to be. We need to get out. We need to get beyond, and then we see where we were supposed to be from the beginning, but you need to get out first and then return.
But that getting out, it's not somewhere else, right? What is that getting out if it's not somewhere else? It's just thinking concealment. Is that right?
So I think in a thinking stance, it is, and for Heidegger, it all begins with thinking rather than, meeting at conferences and talking about, I don't know, climate change and how to tackle it with more technology. Yes, it begins with thinking for him. Yes.
Right. And does this link up with what you were telling me the other day about the difference between resistance and releasement?
Yes.
I really liked that. And it seems relevant here. Could you expand on that a bit?
Yeah. Okay. So I think one of the things that Heidegger learns from Nietzsche is that if you are antithetical, right? He always talks about, don't be resentful. Nietzsche is one of the most resentful people you can read. He's just full of spite for everything and everyone. And to a certain degree, I mean, I'm not a very political thinker or anything, but if you look at, and I don't care either way what people do, anti-fascists, they need fascists, right? And anti-fascism needs fascism in order to, it's a negative identity, if you like. So they are resisting fascism in all its facets, and therefore are completely directed at them. That's who they are. And if you resist something, you feed it. If you resist capitalism, I mean, I'm a punk now. I'm going to look terrible and smell. And 5 years later, it's a fashion. It's a fashion up until this day, right? Why is all of this getting sucked into? And you could even think of Heidegger's, denial of speaking in any way in a communicative way, trying to make himself understandable. Maybe that's also a certain sense of making it inaccessible for ordinary algorithms which function by by copying usual ordinary speech patterns, for example, to put this in a way that I would never speak in. But so if you resist something, you feed what you are resisting. You are against it, and therefore you are not what you are resisting.
Right.
But Gelassenheit, which is the German for releasement, has as its foundation the verb lassen. And the difference, for example, between a metaphysical understanding of being, which would mean ground of beings, right? It's the being, and metaphysics is always the ground of beings. But for Heidegger, being is not the ground. If anything, it's an abyss. It's a yawning emptiness. Being throws around itself the nothing. And the nothing annihilates, he says. And beings are let. So beings is all that is insofar that it is. That's all we can say about them. They are let into a free play. There's nothing that sort of, there's no ground for all beings. So in Gelassenheit, you have that aspect of, or that moment of Lassen. And in that way that he speaks about it, which is us, which is human beings, is that we let ourselves into the world, and and it's almost, and then you release yourself from the demands that all of a sudden don't seem that important anymore, right? I mean, this maybe speaks to you. It's all of a sudden you see, this isn't actually real. Right. You climb up and you open the veil and there's nothing there. So the releasement is, if you oppose something, you make it stronger. If you don't oppose it, but it evaporates.
Right.
It disappears.
Right.
Where is it? Where is that threat of technology if all of a sudden we were to collectively respond to it in a very different way than we do now? Because the way we respond to technology now is language. We need to get ready for the digital age. We need to master digitization. Yada yada. that tells me that we're not in charge. If we need to master the digital age, then the digital age is not our age, right? There's something working against us. But we're trying to either oppose it and be Luddites, or we're trying to fit in with it, live according to the algorithms, right? To get more likes on Instagram, etc. Or feed the evaluation machine, which this thing apparently needs. But if we didn't react as I think for the most part, either trying to fit in and trying to work according to it, and not opposing it either, but in a way being very released towards it, it might show another dimension that we hadn't seen before.
Right. Right. So in a way, it frees you from this false binary of either protesting or complicit involvement.
Yeah.
Because
two is a very dangerous number, and Hegel is wrong about history. So if your dialectics is a way in which you can very easily explain everything, and it's always this either or distinction. Why? The reason you can have this either or distinction is because there's a simultaneity at work anyways.
Okay.
At least two things are possible. But if there are two ways possible, why is there not a third, a fourth, a fifth, a sixth way that by appreciating something else that we usually do and how we usually would do it, that opens up, it's all about Hölderlin, for a very strange poem, I forgot which one, talks about how time tears open horizons. So in time for Heidegger is the self-concealing clearing of being, which means presence. So in any presence, you can think of presence as a realm. Thanks to that realm, beings appear as beings. They light up as what they are. And that always works in a way that very presence is self-concealing. So you don't see Gestalt. You cannot see the essence of technology, of techniques. You don't see it. You can look at as many technological objects as you like. You don't see that realm that makes them possible. But all of a sudden, if you start responding differently and think differently, for example, about time, right? If you don't think about time that it's just passing you by and it's dreadful, another day. Let's kill time, I'm so bored. If you think of time as arising, you start. It changes. It changes the not the perception, but really the way you are in the world.
Right. And so you could say that the authentic person, or the community of authentic persons, the community of mortals, which actively practices the thinking of concealment, is also going to be a community that never resists or never objects to that which is transpiring in the status quo, that perhaps the community of mortals feels certain disagreements with what's transpiring in the world around it outside of the community, but the community of mortals does not resist it, because that would be a kind of vulgar entrapment of by the forces of Das Man. Kind of resisting the injustices around it would be to engage in a kind of nervous, fearful hiding from death, but rather the community of mortals practices an active releasement from that which in the status quo pulls people into injustice, or something like that. Could you say?
I need to hear more about what you mean by injustice, and what do you mean by resisting injustices, because that's beyond how I think about it, but
sure,
I'll try to make sense of it.
Sure, yeah. We don't necessarily need to even go down that route, but I'm just trying to translate what you're saying into just a somewhat more political framework or political schema, in the sense that, people sometimes ask me about my politics, and sometimes, depending on the type of person I'm talking with, I sometimes playfully say that I'm a left-Heideggarian. Yeah. And that's quite playful because I'm by no means a Heidegger expert, as this interview is revealing. But I do know enough about Heidegger and his particular kind of moment in time, and the fact that he is seen as this kind of fairly sinister, extreme right-wing figure, which we'll get to in just a minute. I'd be remiss to let you go without at least a brief discussion of that. I like this notion of a left-Heideggarianism just because it kind of scrambles people's categories and expectations. And for reasons that I think are now quite clear through this interview, the outlines of a left-Heideggarianism, I think, are coming out quite clearly. So I was just trying to basically kind of put a little bit of a cap on that line of inquiry and those types of connections or inferences one might draw from what you're putting out here today. Now, the question of injustice is, I don't necessarily want to advance any particular theory of justice, but I was more just referring to the felt outrage or felt discomfort, the felt disagreement with goings on in the world that strike us as unconscionable, that strike us as false or wrong in some way. So let's be agnostic with respect to what is justice, but I'm talking about the human experience of perceiving and responding to injustices in the world. Is releasement sort of the slogan, in some sense, for a proper political response to the experience of feeling or observing injustices in the world?
I mean, I would begin, what do you mean by observing injustices? I mean, if the outrage culture that we have that showed itself pretty neatly during Coney or something 7 years ago or so, where we can observe everything, right? And then resist everything. We can look at any kind of terrible thing that happens to people all over the world all the time, probably now live because there's so many webcams and whatnot, and then be extremely offended by that and start giving money and resisting and blah blah. How do you resist injustice? I mean, or unfreedom. If there is freedom, there is unfreedom. If the cave tells us anything, then you are free because you're not free at the same time. If there is justice, then there is injustice. So the response is not trying to establish a planetary global solution to all the world's problems. Because if there's anything that any serious philosopher knows, that is that suffering and pain is who we are. I mean, there is no non-tragic existence of being human means to accept tragedy. And that doesn't mean that you accept that people suffer absolutely senseless, terrible situations, or that they, that millions are killed for nothing. But it is, if you think of releasement, what you're actually doing is you are getting rid of will, right? You are denying the will to power. And if Heidegger keeps talking about how the will to power has actually become now a blind will to will that just circles around itself, and that just wills itself to optimize itself, but there's no reason to it. There's no meaning to it. And that leads to more and more distraction. Not distraction, that too, but also destruction of the earth and of human beings, where human beings are just itself now a mess that can be arbitrarily placed anywhere where you need them. Wherever you need to extract value, you put them there, right? You need to extract more value here, you just put 10 million in and extract value until you don't need them anymore. But there's nothing other at work than a blind will. But responding to that with releasement, you are denying the power of that will to will. That's just blindly executing its power over the earth. So you're denying that. And by that denial, and by a return also to who we are anyways, which is mortal beings, there is an acceptance on the one hand of tragedy, but not a giving into it, not a giving up of. But it's, if we talked about the community of mortals, there is that possibility of where suffering and pain isn't blinded out or ignored or medicated or trying to be fought, but actually appreciated and cherished as part of who we are. That's a released, I think, response to that.
Right, that's brilliant. That makes a lot of sense.
The will is raging. I mean, if you look at it closely, make sense of that will to will, it's raging all over the place.
Right.
And resisting that feeds it. That's what it's feeding on.
And the person
that's a willful, will is always will. And Schelling says that Ursein ist Wille. Original being is will. Schopenhauer speaks of the will. So does Nietzsche. That's not arbitrary, right? This understanding of history, which is in continental philosophy, is just that they are just responding to something that's showing itself in modernity anyways. And to Heidegger, it's showing itself now is just a Wille zum Willen, a will to will, that's raging blindly across this planet, destroying everything in its way, and actually feeding on what's resisting it. That's why releasement. Once you release yourself from that, it's not. That's when it begins to crumble.
Right. And so the error of my question was that the person who is kind of constantly scanning the world for possible injustices because they want to monitor and stop injustices where
monitor. You've said it. Then monitor it.
Yeah.
I mean, look. It's very strange that I can sit here very comfortably in London and look at all the injustices anywhere, and then get really angry and get an endorphin. What is it? You're the scientist. You get some kind of an adrenaline kick by feeling really good about myself. It's none of this is to say that suffering is justified and killing a billion here and who gives a shit. That's Nietzsche. Nietzsche would say that, right? Nietzsche would say, what would you prefer, Shakespeare or killing 10 million people? He's like, Shakespeare. if it means killing 10 million, who cares? For Heidegger, no. I mean, Heidegger is extremely concerned about the human being, and the last written words by Heidegger, a couple of days or a month or so before he died, is that he says it's that it's what does he say? I think it's questionable whether in this age of planetary homogenization and in a machine world or something like that, whether there can be something like home. And one of the greatest injustices is when people are deprived of having a dwelling and a home, right? But for him, the reason why that happens is because the will is raging and it needs to destroy everything in its way. It needs to uproot everything and everyone. And by releasing yourself from even what you think is transhistorically is just, maybe we can't even do that. But by being just where you are, but literally just being where you are, and within, where you are, there's nothing stopping you in a release, taking a release stance in a released way. There's nothing stopping you helping people in your community.
Right.
Why would Heidegger oppose that? Right. Quite the opposite, because here you are just where you really are. This is something that you can do in a very immediate sense. That right. There's nothing that, so there's nothing you need to resist. There's nothing stopping anyone in, you can make big campaigns and do long walks through London and help the homeless, or you just invite them into your house literally and give them something to eat, or you just give them something to eat like that, or set something up, a tent every second Saturday where they can have soup or something. Nothing's stopping you from that. But It doesn't have to be sort of almost like a capitalist enterprise that then, look at all these NGOs, and they're just bureaucratic monsters.
Definitely. And that's exactly what I was going to say, which is that the error embedded into my question was that if you're a person who sees themselves as constantly monitoring the scene for possible injustices to stop or to organize against, then all that really means is that you're not practicing releasement, and you're actually highly plugged into precisely the kind of exploitative instrumental rationality that you are most concerned and terrified of and trying to protest, but you're actually trapped in it. If you see yourself as having some kind of will or responsibility to be constantly resisting that which is wrong or bad, all that really means is that you're so already invested in a kind of instrumental rationality that you have no chance of ever living or being anything other than part of that system that you find so unconscionable.
Yeah.
And that's what you just said about the NGOs being essentially capitalist enterprises is just basically a grand kind of dramatization of that problem.
Yeah, and anyone who ever thinks about capital and what it is or how it works knows that it works by critique.
Right.
That's how it needs to progress, and it creates its own critics. One of them is called Jordan Peterson. I mean, he's just the epitome of that, right?
So we've been talking for quite some time now, and I no matter how game you are, everyone's mind starts to atrophy over time, and so you've been very kind enough to say we can go as long as we want, which is wonderful. So we don't need to rush off. I have just a few more questions. I just wanted to basically let you know that I'm not going to hold you on for a whole nother hour, but a few more questions, if that's okay with you. Okay. Is that okay, or are we too long?
Yeah.
Are you fried?
No, it's only just beginning. So
excellent, excellent. Thank you.
Ecstatic time is giving.
I would not so rudely keep someone so long, but you did give me carte blanche, so I'm just using that. So. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground. We've covered most of the topics that I planned to want to talk about. Now, basically, there are just, I think, 3 more questions I want to ask you. 2 of them come from my audience or kind of my ecosystem, let's say, and I'll get to those in a moment. But I think first we should just address the Nazi question. I'm sure that as a Heidegger scholar, someone who's quite interested in Heidegger and evidently one can tell quite sympathetic to Heidegger's philosophical ideas, I'm sure that you are often confronted with some raised eyebrows. Wasn't he a Nazi? How can you be interested in the thought of Martin Heidegger? What's your take on that?
Not as often as you'd think.
Okay.
I guess it depends on where you are. I mean, it's certainly not just speaking from the academic world. It's certainly not a topic at most Heidegger conferences ever. It is. I have private students who I teach Heidegger. They see it in the way that Wagner had some pretty terrible views. I still enjoy his operas. Heidegger says about Wagner that Wagner is completely silly and awful. But that there's no way of responding to that in a way that satisfies everyone, because I guess the ordinary answer would be, oh, he was terrible, but let's just blind that out. That was a period in his time. I think Heidegger is a fascinating thinker for a variety of reasons, and one of them is that he's so modern, right? He gets sucked into that. Into that most modern movements, one of the most expressions of the 20th century, which is fascism. He becomes extremely taken almost by Hitler himself. So he never met him, and he didn't go to Berlin. I think he had received a call to become a lecturer or professor in Berlin. He didn't go. He wanted to stay where he was, and he saw in it. When you think about it, this is 1933. He saw in it, I think, the possibility that an opening in the history of being itself. He hadn't quite called it that yet, I think, at the time. He didn't speak of history of being, but it certainly, he thought that he could use this movement for his own, creating philosopher kings, right? Having a proper university again. This is an enthusiasm. It was a moment of enthusiasm. I mean, that's probably what it was. I was not there. It's what people say who were there at the time, and he was very much involved with it, to the degree of firing Jewish members of staff. I think I'm, as you can tell, I'm not very good in terms of actual historiography. I'm interested in the thinking, but I think there are two ways of thinking about it. You can go, people talk a lot about the Black Notebooks. I haven't read them yet. It's certainly not, when they came out, it was a huge media circus, and it's certainly not 1,000 pages on the Jew. It's just not. They are mentioned a couple of times. They're mentioned in a way that's sometimes doesn't say much, and sometimes it's just standard anti-Semitic prejudices, just standard, notions of worldlessness, etc. And then, however, there are the public talks that have been, I think, very often misinterpreted. And they are much more important, I think, much more important, because we have to give Heidegger a bit of a benefit of the doubt, maybe, and that's in the Bremer Vorträge. So this is in Bremen, in Germany, right after the war. He gives a talk on, and this is appalling to many people, and I can see why. He says that there is no difference between technological or technical production of crops and gas chambers. Now that's appalling to people, because it sounds like what he's saying is, what's the difference? It's all the same production. But what Heidegger is saying, look, this is why it's so terrible. That's how I understand. I think that what he's saying here is that the Holocaust or the gas chambers, etc., are so extremely gross, disgusting, and terrible because they produce bodies, dead bodies. They don't. And if we started this conversation by talking about death as the own-most possibility. So the most authentic way of being is that you are allowed to die your death, and only you can die your death. No one can die for you. That's why it's your own-most possibility. Anything else, someone can represent you, someone can step in, someone can replace you, but not your death. You can only die your death. You cannot die for anyone else. You will die your death. And he says in these public talks, that, do they die? Are they dying? He repeats that question a couple of times, and he says they're being, translating now from memory, they're being put down, and then he just ends by saying, I think they're being produced as bodies. So I understand that as saying they weren't even allowed to die. So what for Heidegger makes us human, which is our death, our mortality, not even that. That's the crime. The crime is that they were completely destroyed. And someone who thinks that Heidegger would be in favor of the Holocaust is completely out of his mind. Because the Holocaust is that ultimate, that's where the will to will is visible. It's just a blind, raging will for nothing. It's just, what's the meaning of that?
Right.
And
so
that's how I understand these public remarks, and that's how I've thought about it so far, and I've not. Yeah.
So your take is that he was just unfortunately swept away in a popular enthusiasm, but it wasn't very reflective of his deeper beliefs.
I mean, there's a note in the Black Notebook somewhere where he says that this was the biggest mistake he ever made, was to take on the rectorship.
Oh, okay.
That he was completely, that everything within him was opposed to that. So that's one of the remarks that I remember from the discussion when they came out. And
so then what was the degree of his positive agreement or endorsement or participation, would you say?
I'm not an expert in this at all. And there are people who are, proper historians and in that regard, but I mean, it is also very strange when you think of Heidegger as a nationalist, because he isn't. I mean, one of the things he talks about in the letter on humanism, at least, he's very, very much opposed to nations. He's also opposed to, for example, the nationalization of language. For him, nationalizing a language like the German language is a destruction of that language. It destroys dialects. It eradicates vernacular. So it's very ambivalent. I think he was in favor of it insofar as he thought that this is the possibility for a return to not a return, but that there's an opening of history where all of a sudden that he could lead people towards where he wanted the world to go. And you could even think of his withdrawal and later on as because he wanted to have an impact, obviously, right? There was something at stake in being in time. And that this is a moment of authenticity. This is a moment of possibility. You can finally, Europe, or for him, of course, Germany, would reach itself again. And he does have these moments where he says, you can only philosophize in German and Greek. And people will always interpret that as saying, oh, this is extremely racist or something. I don't particularly think that it is. But I mean, there are people you can talk to about this, like Richard Polt. They probably know more about this. I think he saw an opening. I think he was following that possibility, and then stepped down, saw the destruction it would bring, and I certainly maybe also perhaps blamed himself a bit. But I would never think that, from anything I've read so far, that he would be in favor of an industrial level destruction of human life. Nothing that I've read so far.
Okay, so he was anti-Semitic in the way that was fairly average at the time. He was not especially devoted or passionately committed to the Nazi cause. He unfortunately was swept away in the enthusiasm. He did participate. He did kind of make that mistake. But you do see it as a kind of a mistake, that it was a kind of
people tend to make mistakes, right? I mean,
right, of course, right. I'm just clarifying how you see it in relation to the philosophies, because some people would say that there are deep aspects of his philosophical perspective that lean him towards.
But you would have to quote one of those.
What's that?
You would have to refer to one of those.
Well, I'm not actually familiar enough with the argument other than knowing that it's a popular refrain, right? So I was just curious, but you don't buy that, really? You don't think that anything about his philosophy in any kind of deep way lends itself or disposes someone towards fascism or Nazism? You don't think that?
Do you?
Well, I know I don't. I've never gotten that impression from my reading of him, and I'm quite sympathetic to what the message I'm getting from you. I think if I'm hearing you correctly, that in fact Heidegger was perhaps more than anyone deeply horrified at the prospects of kind of mass industrialized carnage of all kinds that he was precisely quite concerned about and against. So yeah, that critique I never quite understood the critique, other than I just wanted to ask you what you thought about it.
Yeah, I guess I would agree with that. I mean, there are disturbing passages in the Black Notebooks, obviously, and
Johannes, I should try to kind of steelman the argument. I feel like maybe I'm not doing it justice. I mean, I guess being more sympathetic to this critique, just to give a strong version of the argument for you to respond to, and then we can move on. It's that it's precisely stuff like a return of God, a kind of openness to some kind of opening of authenticity. These types of terms nowadays, whenever you start even talking like these terms, people, contemporary kind of secular modern people, they feel icky about it. They feel like, oh yeah, if you believe in things like this, if you think that the structure of being can open up to you in rare glimpses of insight and unconcealment, and you talk about an openness to a return from God and these sorts of things, that makes you the type of person who is going to support the next charismatic dictator who says that he's here to save us. So that would be the link. I think people do think that there's a functional link between a kind of Heideggerian perspective in the way that I just articulated, and a kind of likelihood of being duped by charismatic genocidal dictators. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I don't think about that. I don't care about that.
Okay.
And also, I mean, if so-called atheistic rationalists who live very comfortable lives in urban centers, maybe they are very prone to supporting faceless technocratic entities that are completely void of meaning. I mean, you can always make up any link. Heidegger says that, therefore he's this. I mean, the only thing really that would be interesting is if the Black Notebooks had actually been as terrible as people had made them out to be. And it's not like, also this kind of this argument that all of philosophy is, you can read many things in many ways, but also to say that it's infected. I mean, it's such a strange way of addressing how thinking works. Thinking is not us. Like if you don't accept that, and you should not even know the name Heidegger. Thinking is not the act of a subject that somehow is self-referential and has images in his mind, etc., and then tries to rationally make sense of it. Well, thinking is not detached from us, but comes to the human being. So, and if someone would deny that there is even, yes, there is an opening, but there's also an opening for, so that if someone believes that there are openings in history, that doesn't mean that you automatically follow a charismatic. Why would that follow? I don't even understand that. Why would that follow?
Okay. Thank you for responding to that.
How would that follow?
What's that?
I want to understand that. How would that follow?
Oh, well, to be clear, again, I don't subscribe to this fear, but again, trying to steelman it, I guess the idea is that it makes you kind of gullible, would kind of be the idea. Like if you believe in these somewhat mystical sounding possibilities on the horizon, then you might just be more liable than the next guy to be duped by the person who kind of pretends to occupy this kind of messiah role. Whereas, if you just don't believe in any possibilities of history ever opening up anything interesting, somehow that's supposed to be like a healthier or like more enlightened perspective. If you're just radically closed off to the possibility of life or society ever being different than it is now in kind of oppressed, homogenous time, then the good thing about that is you'll never get duped by the next Hitler. That's the thinking.
Well, but it doesn't end war or senseless destruction, as we are, very. I'm sorry, war is very much a reality for most people, and we have outsourced it. There was a time when during the Bush years, we were at least honest about it because we still watched it on the news. During the Obama years, it was just completely hidden and concealed with the drone wars and the most illegal wars ever waged by an elected president. There is a state of total war now. It's just that this war is just completely meaningless. The U.S. is a crumbling empire that's still in Afghanistan. Most people probably don't even remember that. And so maybe they weren't gullible to some genocidal dictator, but that doesn't change the fact that war is a reality. It's just that now it's completely void of any meaning.
Right. Okay. So, Johannes, just 2 more questions, and then you're free. And don't feel obligated to give extremely impressive answers to these questions, as impressive as the previous answers you've given. Feel free to take them a little bit more rapid fire if you're feeling a bit taxed at this point in the conversation. And these questions come from Anthony Morley, and I thought they were very good questions myself also, so that's why I'm keen to ask them. The first is, to what degree do you see Heidegger's philosophy as a Catholic philosophy?
Oh, never really thought about that. Why would it be Catholic?
I think Anthony said something about how Heidegger was flirting with Jesuit training. Is that wrong?
No, he was he was supposed to become a priest, I think. Yeah.
Right. So, and then I think there was an allusion to the significance of Aristotle and Aquinas in Heidegger. That's a question, though. I'm asking: is there much there, or no, in your view?
To Aristotle and Aquinas.
That being the Catholic connection, in other words. You might not be
Aristotle Catholic.
Well, right. So in Catholic thought, Aristotle and Aquinas loom large, obviously. And so the question that I received from Anthony was, is there an interesting or significant kind of Catholic thread via Aristotle and Aquinas in Heidegger's philosophy, or not? I mean, your answer might just be you don't think so, or you're not aware. I don't know.
I'm not entirely sure how to. I mean, those questions are. You know why I don't like these questions is because they are these typical. Do you think that Nietzsche was influenced by this guy? That's not how history works. I mean, first of all, you have to tell me what Catholic means. Then and then Heidegger grew up Catholic. He grew up next to the church. His father worked at the church. So yes, he's Catholic. He's Catholic in that very badische sense, in the Swabian sense that he grew up in. And certainly you could say also that the philosophical standpoint is that some of his understanding of being is mediated by the scholastics. So here you have the Aquinas part. And then he told his students, you don't need to read me if you haven't read Aristotle for at least 5 years. So Aristotle is where Heidegger is someone who Heidegger is wrestling with. But if you say Catholic, if you mean by Aquinas, is Catholic, but there's no Protestantism at the time. So if Catholic just means that Heidegger believes in a creator God, no. If there are whether there are influences, certainly there are, because he grew up Catholic. Does he believe? Is he a practicing Catholic? He goes to church, I guess, every Sunday. He did, but I don't think that he believed much in it. But I think the question would have to be more precise in the sense that it would have to point to how, for example, the history of being, which is something we haven't talked about yet, how that has to do with Catholicism, or, for example, with how the church interpreted being to a certain degree, right? And if then you could say, for example, that there was an understanding of being that everything was created. And for Heidegger, the creator God is one of the aspects that factors into us becoming creators, or trying to become creator gods ourselves. So that's probably not a very satisfying answer to someone.
No, that's great. That's fine. Yeah, I appreciate that. And actually, the last question was also a kind of influence or genealogy question. So since you reject those questions, I think I'll spare you of the last question.
Okay. Any more?
What's that?
I mean, I can still go. I don't care.
Okay, if you insist, I'll give you the last one. So the last one is just this. What do you think about post-Heideggerian projects, in particular the Heideggerian strands of French theory after Heidegger, so deconstruction, Derrida, and in particular the image people have nowadays of French postmodern philosophy? And let's say in particular its image of being highly relativistic, representing the kind of rejection of meta narratives and these types of motifs that are associated with French postmodernism. To what degree is Heidegger responsible for that, or is that a bad perversion of the Heideggerian outlook?
Yeah, I mean, I guess no one can control where or how their thoughts are being received.
Mm-hmm.
I think that the Heidegger that not most people, but many people know is the Heidegger of French philosophy. So it's the Heidegger in the public mind is somewhat someone who criticizes presence. We have to think about absence. That's Derrida, and then the main problem with the French, their language was extremely nationalized. They've almost lost all of their dialects, and then Heidegger comes along, and there's someone who speaks in a way that's completely outrageous, and that's very liberating, I think, maybe for a French reader, and they're quite drawn to him. And however, when Heidegger speaks of Seinsgeschichte, Geschichte, as he makes clear already in Being in Time, is not Historie. So there is in the Romanic language of French, and there is not in English either, there's no translation for the word Geschichte. History does not quite capture it. History is Historie in German, and that's sort of, I think when I say history, you might think of something that's written, that can be data, that's in the past. And I think that's to a certain degree how Foucault, even though I'm not too familiar with that, would understand Heidegger as just giving genealogies, as just looking up a word in the dictionary. Oh, this is what it meant 500 years ago. Close the dictionary and then say we need to return to this meaning. Or Anwesen, right? Usia, sein, which is translated as presence, présence, is Heidegger says there is also withdrawal, and that's absence in English, and I don't know the French, maybe it's absence, I don't know. And then the Derridean Heidegger is the Heidegger who focuses on absence, and that is not quite accurate. I think that it's not it's not about they misunderstood him or they got him wrong. It's just that there are problems in translation, and they literally don't translate. There are ways of thinking that you cannot translate. This is why you cannot translate the word logos. Why? Because it doesn't mean much anymore when you've translated it. So a way of and postmodern philosophy, I think one of the other questions that was in there is whether Heidegger is responsible for the relativism.
Yeah, that's the impression anyway. I mean, it's a very cartoonish kind of view of postmodern French philosophy, but the relativism that's associated with postmodernism, that's not very Heideggerian. Is that right?
And Heidegger on top of it, I would think, is just not a moral thinker. I just don't find anything in there where you could. I mean, there are texts that I haven't read where he does talk about the diabolical, etc. So those categories come back when he gets older.
Or more epistemological relativism, you could say. I guess people are kind of confused by the line that goes particularly through Derrida. It is kind of a weird transformation of a Heideggerian kind of intellectual drive that gets filtered through Derrida, and then all of a sudden people are able to kind of think, oh, there is no truth, there is no single text, there is, this kind of idea with a weirdly kind of Heideggerian kind of flavor to it.
I didn't think of that. Well, I mean, Heidegger is all about truth.
Right.
It's all about trying to understand truth in a way that is not typically epistemological, which is correspondence truth, and not absolute truth either. So truth as aletheia is foundational to his thinking. You cannot make sense of his thought without thinking, without accepting truth. That's what drives it, right?
Right.
And that there is no. I mean, maybe there is no one text for Heidegger either, but there is certainly a way of making sense of the history of being that then only becomes visible thanks to Heidegger, which is sort of which Heidegger sees as necessary to think through these fundamental texts and not deconstructing them and saying that they're just artificial constructs. They all articulate something very real and something historical. But the place we're in now is that all we do is we go back and say Aristotle is wrong because science has shown us this, or we go back and argue about minor details. And this goes on forever and ever and ever. It doesn't really seem to say much anymore. And for Heidegger, that's a sign that metaphysics has come to an end. So in that regard, Derrida and Heidegger sort of overlap, right? But it's just the conclusion that they draw is different. Because I think for someone like Derrida, I don't want to do any injustice to him or anyone who reads him, that's a triumphant moment, or isn't it? It's something that finally, anything goes. We don't need logos anymore. And Heidegger says, no, this is where actually we have to be very careful, because now we have to think through that history again and think through what it has forgotten.
Dude, Johannes, this was awesome. Seriously, this was really amazing. I'm not kidding. More than one person in the chat said that they thought this was possibly the best live stream I've ever done. So thank you so much, man. This was really fun.
Thank you for that. Can I just say it was a great pleasure meeting you in London.
Oh, thanks.
I hope that I'll let you back in. And
one day.
Come meet. And it would be great if people could subscribe to my YouTube channel. There's more on that. I think it's in the comment or something.
That's right.
I don't have Twitter, I think. I'm not quite sure if I have it. But I have Instagram, so people can follow me there too.
Great.
And I'm trying to make more videos. I'm working on a book. And if anyone's interested in Heidegger, really on some level, I teach Heidegger. I teach it privately. Just reach out to me. That would be great. And yes, thank you all so much for listening. And thank you, Justin.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad to have you on. Maybe we can do it again sometime. I was also going to encourage my listeners, anyone out there, definitely check out Johannes's stuff. I think Johannes has really just started making stuff on the internet. But I think, as you saw in this talk, he's the real deal and has really, really interesting takes that I think are really well aligned with my perspective and the types of themes that I know you all are interested because you're here. So yeah, definitely check out Johannes's stuff. And like Johannes was saying, he does private tutoring. So if you're interested in that, check it out. But also, I'm sure Johannes would be happy to just chat briefly. If you want to send questions or comments or talking points to Johannes, I'm sure he would kindly interact with any of you. If any of you want to follow up on any of these ideas, shoot him a message on Instagram or check out his YouTube, subscribe to his YouTube, subscribe to all of his stuff. Johannes, I really hope you start making more videos along these lines, because I think your knowledge and familiarity with Heidegger and other philosophies obviously top notch, but more specifically, just the style of your perspective, the particular way that you see things, I think is not only really useful and illuminating. Useful is a sort of an insult at this point. It's not the right word that I was looking for. I wouldn't reduce it to being useful, but your understanding is not just highly familiar and convincing and compelling, but it immediately produces illuminating and emboldening, and to use a somewhat corny word, but at least better than useful, a kind of, I find it very empowering, the perspective that you have on Heidegger, the way that you kind of can extract really, insights that unlock other puzzles in the minds of people who are thinking about contemporary society and contemporary technology in the ways that I am, and the way that we do in kind of my little community here. So yeah, man, I can't endorse you enough. And I think in the future, when people ask me, why is Heidegger interesting, or why should anyone care, or what, or wasn't he a Nazi? How dare you be interested in him? I think this live stream, and then when it goes to the podcast, I think it will become one of the best places someone could possibly go to basically learn all about that in less than 3 hours. So thank you so much, man. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It was a very great conversation. Last time, just to mention this, we talked, I think, for 8 hours.
We did.
Yeah. And it's very strange when these things happen, right? But it's very wonderful always. And maybe at some point we can talk about the history of being, because that's just fundamentally important, I think.
Excellent. I'll put it in my notes as a possible topic for a round 2 sometime in the future. But right. And as you make, if you start to make more videos and stuff like that on the internet, definitely send them my way. And I definitely would like to see you make all kinds of stuff to this effect. And I support that definitely.
There's actually a video I made with a professor I know in Italy. It's going to be in English.
Okay.
It will come out next Saturday. So it's on Heidegger and on technology.
Okay.
And yeah, that'll be very, very, very concise and very good for people to really want to know more specifically on technology and Heidegger.
Excellent. All right. Well, once again, just thanks so much. This was really epic. And I appreciate it. I'll be in touch with you, Johannes, for sure.
Cheers. Talk soon. Bye.